All right, all week you've heard about this, the scandal that rocked the city of Los Angeles after several Latino members of the city council were caught on tape making racist comments.
The fact that there is a system, there's pigmentocracy in, Latin America that privileges whiteness and, you're sort of at the bottom if you're black or indigenous, that's very real.
Who you gonna call?
Huh?
Who are you gonna call?
Immigration.
For what?
For you.
Why?
Because you're not legal.
In early 2022, a scandal erupted in Mexico City that exposed an ugly truth the country had been trying to hide. Several employees of an upscale steakhouse came forward with a damning allegation. The restaurant had a policy of segregating customers based on their skin color. The best tables were reserved for lighter-skinned individuals. Within days, activists mounted a boycott, and the city launched an investigation. The restaurant in question, however, denied everything. But for millions of dark-skinned Mexicans, this wasn't shocking news. It was just another Tuesday. You see, Mexico has a problem it doesn't want to talk about. A problem so deeply embedded in its society that until 2019, the country didn't even officially acknowledge that Black Mexicans existed.
Black people in Mexico were not even acknowledged until recent years. Their presence was not acknowledged by the government up until very recent years. But yet, they have been there since days of slavery.
Think about that. In a country of 127 million people, where over 2.5 million citizens identify as Black or Afro-Mexican, it took until 2019 for the federal constitution to recognize them as a people. But here's where it gets even darker. According to Afro-Mexican activist Yolanda Camacho Calleja, many Black Mexicans deliberately avoid identifying as Afro-Mexican in official censuses, fearing the discrimination that comes with being labeled as Black. When you look at what they're trying to escape, the data tells a brutal story. If you're a dark-skinned Mexican, you'll likely complete only 6.5 years of schooling. Your light-skinned counterpart, they'll get 10 years. That's a staggering 45% gap in educational achievement. While there are many factors that make up that statistic, we can all acknowledge that the numbers are real and it's a problem. But it doesn't stop there. While the average Mexican household brings in about $193 a month, dark-skinned citizens earn just $137, a crushing 41.5% less than their white compatriots. This isn't some accidental oversight. This isn't just lingering prejudice. This is systematic erasure, a deliberate whitening of Mexican society. Now that's a very controversial statement, I know, but the truth is, this problem stretches back to colonial times, continuing to shape the lives of Mexicans today. And to understand how Mexico got here, how a country that proudly declares itself a cosmic race of mixed heritage could systematically discriminate against its Black citizens, we need to go back, way back, to a time when the Spanish Empire was carving up the Americas and a complex system of racial hierarchy would plant the seeds for centuries of discrimination to come. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You want the cold, hard truth, don't you? That's why you're watching our channel. Let's dive in. Mexico loves to paint itself as a post-racial paradise, a place where everyone is just Mexican. In 2010, CONAPRED, Mexico's own National Council to Prevent Discrimination, conducted its first national survey on discrimination. Despite being the federal agency specifically tasked with fighting discrimination, their survey painted a very specific picture of Mexico. According to them, age, gender, and social class were supposedly the main factors affecting people's daily lives. But here's the shocking part. This government body, whose entire purpose is to prevent discrimination, didn't even mention Afro-Mexicans or the discrimination they face in their survey. Think about that. In a government study specifically designed to measure discrimination, Black Mexicans were so invisible, they weren't even counted. The irony gets deeper. When Mexico's National Institute of Statistics and Geography finally did survey attitudes about race, the results exposed the myth of Mexico's colorblind society. 21% of women and 24% of men wouldn't rent a room to an Afro-descendant person. 11% of women and 12% of men openly admitted they would oppose their child marrying a Black person. 56% of those surveyed acknowledged that the rights of Afro-descendant people were respected, little or not at all. Yet despite this data, Mexico's government continued to deny the problem. Even the country's president, in a moment of astounding tone deafness, declared that racial mixing was the future of humanity. But here's the thing about myths. They crumble when faced with cold, hard data. Let's break down the numbers. Mexico's National Institute of Statistics found that when you look at white-collar office jobs, 27% of these positions are held by white Mexicans. But in the agricultural sector, white Mexicans make up only 5% of workers. Think about that gap. It's not random chance. Even when dark-skinned Mexicans get an education, they face systematic barriers to professional advancement. And when it comes to basic necessities, the kind of things most people take for granted, the disparities are shocking. While only 2.5% of light-skinned Mexicans lack running water in their homes, that number jumps to 11% for dark-skinned citizens. Need a bathroom? Just 7.5% of white Mexicans don't have one at home. But if you're dark-skinned, that number soars to 20%. These are the kinds of stories that need to be told, the data that shatters race-blind myths. And if you're as passionate as I am about uncovering the truths others try to sweep under the rug, leave a like and comment to help show your support for the message we're trying to spread. But surely, you might think, this is about class, not race, about poor regions versus rich ones. That's exactly what many Mexicans argue, that dark-skinned citizens tend to live in historically disadvantaged areas. So of course the numbers look bad. Here's the thing though, when researchers controlled for every other factor, gender, age, region, even ethnic origin, skin color still emerged as the single most powerful predictor of a person's wealth and education. But these aren't just numbers on a page. Want to see how this racism plays out in real life? In 2013, Aeromexico put out a casting call for a commercial with one simple requirement: Nadi Moreno, no dark-skinned people need apply. Just imagine that, Mexico's largest airline openly saying, if you're dark-skinned, you can't even pretend to be our customer on TV. Even more shocking, Mexican police have actually deported their own citizens to Haiti and Honduras, not because they did anything wrong, but simply because their skin was too dark to be real Mexicans. Think about that. In a country that claims to be colorblind, you can be thrown out of your own homeland for being too black. To understand how Mexico got here, how a nation could deport its own citizens for being too dark, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when the Spanish Empire first carved up the Americas and created a system of racial hierarchy so effective that its shadows still darken Mexico today. The year was 1519. Spanish conquistadors had just landed on Mexico's shores, and they brought with them two things that would forever change the country: an obsession with racial categorization and enslaved Africans to work their newly stolen lands. In fact, among the very first conquistadors who helped topple the Aztec Empire were 6 black men. From the very start, the Spanish colonizers were meticulous about categorizing people by race. They created what they called a caste system. Think of it as an elaborate racial hierarchy where the lighter your skin, the more rights you had. At the top, pure-blooded Spaniards born in Spain, called peninsulares. Below them, their children born in Mexico, known as criollos. And at the bottom, indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. But here's where it gets interesting. The Spanish became obsessed with documenting every possible racial mixture. They even made paintings of these categories. Have a Spanish father and an indigenous mother? You're a mestizo. Spanish and African parents? You're a mulatto. Have a mulatto parent and a Spanish parent? Now you're a Morisco. The combinations went on and on, each with its own label, each with its own place in the hierarchy. And the stakes were high. Your caste determined everything: what jobs you could hold, where you could live, even what clothes you could wear. If you were lucky enough to have fair skin, you might be able to pass as someone from a higher caste. This created a perverse incentive that still echoes in Mexican society today. Mejorando la raza, improving the race by marrying someone lighter skinned than yourself. Between 1580 and 1650, nearly 250,000 Africans were forcibly brought to Mexico, primarily from what we now know as Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Congo, Angola, and Mozambique. By the early 1600s, Mexico's African slave population had grown larger than anywhere else in Latin America. When Mexico finally counted its African population in 1810, they made up more than 10% of the entire country. By comparison, actual Spaniards made up less than 1%. These enslaved Africans didn't just provide labor, they shaped the entire economy of New Spain. They worked in silver mines, sugar plantations, textile factories, and cattle ranches. In urban areas, they served as skilled artisans, vendors, and domestic workers. By 1570, they were so skilled at certain trades that Spanish guilds, fearing competition, actually banned them from practicing prestigious crafts like silk weaving. But perhaps most importantly, They brought with them knowledge and skills that would prove invaluable in the New World. Many came from regions with advanced agricultural techniques, mining expertise, and military capabilities. This knowledge would soon become crucial for those who dared to resist the system, because not everyone accepted their place in this racial hierarchy. Among these rebels against Spanish tyranny, one man's story stands above all others, though you won't find him in Mexican textbooks today. His name was Gaspar Yanga, and he would lead one of the most successful slave rebellions in the Americas. Yet most Mexicans have never heard his name. Yanga was an enslaved African, believed to be of royal descent from Gabon, who arrived during the first wave of forced African migration to Mexico. He was one of the many the Spanish had trafficked from the shores of West Africa. By that point, Mexico's African population had grown so large, it actually outnumbered the Spanish. In 1570, against the backdrop of growing tensions in colonial Mexico, Yanga orchestrated something that would shake the foundations of Spanish colonial power. At a time when enslaved Africans were being worked to death in sugar plantations, silver mines, and textile factories across New Spain, he led an uprising of enslaved people into the mountainous regions of Veracruz. This wasn't just an escape, it was an organized rebellion against the entire colonial system. The rebels became known as Chimarrones, and their very existence challenged Spanish authority in ways that would echo through generations. These communities sprang up in the most remote and difficult terrain they could find, a strategy that wasn't just about hiding, but about survival and defense. The Spanish authorities quickly learned that these weren't just disorganized bands of fugitives. These were sophisticated settlements led by people who brought with them centuries of knowledge from West and West Central Africa. Now, that same expertise was being turned against them. The Cimarrones used their agricultural knowledge to establish sustainable food supplies, growing crops they knew from Africa. Their military experience helped them defend their settlements and even conduct strategic raids on Spanish caravans. But perhaps most threatening to the Spanish authorities was how these communities preserved and maintained their African cultural traditions. While enslaved people in Spanish cities were forced to abandon their cultures, the Cimarrones in their mountain strongholds kept their languages, religious practices, and social customs alive. They formed alliances with indigenous communities, creating new cultural fusions that would influence Mexican society for centuries to come, even if that influence would later be denied. What made Yanga's rebellion particularly significant was its timing and scale. While there had been smaller uprisings before, the Spanish had documented slave revolts as early as 1537 and 1540. Yanga's group would establish something unprecedented, the first free black settlement in the Americas, an achievement that would inspire similar rebellions throughout Mexico and beyond. The choice of location wasn't random. Like many African leaders before him, Yanga understood the strategic value of mountainous terrain. The difficult-to-reach areas of Veracruz provided natural protection against Spanish attacks and offered rich soil for agriculture. What made Yanga's settlement unique was its organization. Drawing from their diverse African backgrounds, many of the settlers came from regions with advanced agricultural and military traditions. They created a thriving community that combined farming with strategic defense. They cultivated crops they knew from Africa, raised livestock, and established trade networks with sympathetic indigenous communities. But they weren't just farmers. Under Yanga's leadership, they became master strategists. For nearly 4 decades, they conducted carefully planned raids on Spanish caravans traveling between Veracruz and Mexico City. These weren't random attacks. They specifically targeted shipments of goods and supplies, while also helping other enslaved people escape. Their reputation grew so fearsome that Spanish merchants began avoiding the region entirely, costing the colonial government significant revenue. The Spanish tried repeatedly to crush this resistance. They sent military expeditions into the mountains, but each time, Yanga's people used their knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver them. The community's military prowess wasn't just about fighting. They developed sophisticated early warning systems and evacuation plans that kept their people safe during attacks. By 1609, after years of failed attempts to defeat them, the Spanish colonial authorities were forced to do something unprecedented: negotiate with people they considered property. Yanga, demonstrating remarkable political acumen, demanded not just freedom for his people, but an official charter for their settlement. This charter would make San Lorenzo de los Negros the first legally recognized free black settlement in the Americas. The negotiations themselves were groundbreaking. Yanga secured guarantees of self-governance, the right to bear arms, and protection from re-enslavement. The settlement would be required to pay tribute to the Spanish crown, but in exchange, they would have autonomy over their internal affairs. This wasn't just a concession, It was a recognition of Black political power in colonial Mexico. San Lorenzo de los Negros, later renamed Yanga in 1932, became more than just a town. It was proof that resistance could succeed, that enslaved people could force their oppressors to the negotiating table. The settlement inspired similar communities throughout Mexico. These palenques, or free Black settlements, sprang up in remote areas, particularly in the coastal regions where large enslaved populations worked on plantations. These communities weren't just places of refuge, they were centers of African cultural preservation. While enslaved people in the cities were often forced to abandon their traditions, in the palenques, they could maintain their languages, religious practices, and social customs. They created unique fusion cultures, blending African traditions with indigenous and Spanish influences, contributing to the rich cultural tapestry of colonial Mexico. But Yanga's legacy went beyond just inspiring other escaped slaves. His successful negotiation with colonial authorities created a template for resistance that would be used by other marginalized groups throughout Mexico. His story proved that even within the brutal Spanish colonial system, determined resistance could force change. However, the story of Yanga and Mexico's African heritage would soon be deliberately erased from the nation's memory, because in 1810, something happened that would change everything. 1810. Mexico had just won its independence after 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule, but its new leaders faced an impossible problem. Before them stood a nation fractured by a rigid caste system, where your skin color determined everything from the work you could do to the clothes you could wear. The Spanish were gone, but they left behind a society shaped by their obsession with racial hierarchy. In this new nation, African descendants made up more than 10% of the population, far outnumbering the Spanish colonizers who had crafted this system. How do you unite a country where the color of your skin had, for centuries, determined your entire destiny? Their solution would prove both simple and devastating. They would create a new identity, something they called La Raza Cósmica, the cosmic race. The groundwork for this erasure started immediately after independence. In 1810, José María Morelos abolished slavery and the caste system, declaring that all citizens would be treated equally and recognized simply as Mexicans. On the surface, it sounded like progress, but this seemingly noble gesture carried a poison pill. By declaring everyone equal, it created a myth of colorblindness that would be used to ignore centuries of racial inequality. But the real architect of Mexico's racial erasure would come later. In the 1920s, philosopher José Vasconcelos developed his theory of La Raza Cósmica, the cosmic race. His vision was that Mexico would transcend race by mixing everyone together into a new, superior breed of humanity. It sounded progressive, it sounded inclusive, but there was a dark undercurrent to his theory. In Vasconcelos' cosmic race, European features were the ideal. Indigenous traits would be tolerated as part of the mix, but African features, those were meant to disappear entirely. He didn't even try to hide his anti-Black racism. He described Black people as eager for sensual joy, intoxicated with dances and unbridled lust, who would be absorbed by the superior type and redeemed gradually through voluntary extinction. This wasn't just academic philosophy. It became official government policy. The post-revolutionary Mexican state embraced what they called mestizaje, the idea that Mexico was a nation of mixed-race people. But this mixing wasn't meant to celebrate diversity. Instead, it was a deliberate strategy to whiten the population. They even had a term for it, mejorando la raza, improving the race by marrying someone lighter-skinned. The impact was systematic and far-reaching. In schools, history textbooks were rewritten to minimize or completely omit the African presence in Mexican history, the contributions of Black Mexicans to the independence struggle, including heroes like José María Morelos and General Vicente Guerrero, who were of African descent, were quietly stripped of their racial identity. The erasure went beyond just education. Government censuses stopped counting the Black population entirely. The last official count of Africans in Mexico had been in 1810. After that, nothing. Black Mexicans were often forced to identify as indigenous in censuses, even though their ethnic and cultural roots were markedly different. The effects rippled through every aspect of society. Black communities that had existed for centuries found themselves increasingly isolated, particularly in regions like Costa Chica and Veracruz. Without official recognition, they were cut off from government resources and development programs. Many areas where Afro-Mexicans lived lacked basic infrastructure. Roads, schools, Healthcare facilities. This erasure was so complete that by the late 20th century, many Mexicans genuinely believed there were no black people in their country. Some Afro-Mexicans didn't even know their own history. They thought they were, in their words, weird indigenous people because of their hair texture and skin color. The systematic denial ran so deep that Mexican immigration officials would sometimes detain and deport their own black citizens, simply because they couldn't believe that black people could be Mexican. There are documented cases of Afro-Mexicans being deported to Haiti or Honduras purely based on their appearance, a cruel irony in a country that claims not to see race. It wasn't until 2015 that Mexico finally allowed people to identify as Afro-Mexican in a national survey, the first official recognition of their existence in over 2 centuries. The results were revealing. Approximately 1.4 million Mexicans identified as having African ancestry. Even then, activists believe this number is far lower than reality, as many black Mexicans, conditioned by centuries of erasure, still hesitate to identify themselves as such. The constitutional recognition in 2019 marked another milestone, but it came after decades of grassroots organizing by black Mexican activists. Organizations like Mexico Negro had been fighting since 1997 for official recognition of Afro-Mexican identity. Their first annual meeting of black towns marked the beginning of an organized movement that would take more than 20 years to achieve its first major victory. But recognition alone isn't enough. Today, black activists in Mexico are fighting not just against discrimination, but against centuries of systematic erasure. They're demanding not just to be counted, but to be seen, not just to be acknowledged, but to be valued. They're pushing for representation in media, politics, and education, fighting against a system that for 2 centuries has pretended they don't exist. The question now isn't whether racism exists in Mexico. The data makes that undeniable. The question is whether Mexico is finally ready to confront its anti-black racism, to acknowledge its African heritage, and to create real equality, not by erasing differences, but by celebrating them. Because right now, in 2024, millions of black Mexicans are still waiting for their country to accept a simple truth. You can't solve racism by pretending race doesn't exist.